Perhaps, in the human journey, no one can escape the encounter with suffering. No matter how hard we try, how virtuously we live, one day the waves of loss, loneliness, disappointment, or anxiety will still come. They need no invitation, no reason, quietly entering our lives as an inevitable part of existence. And then, we begin to ask ourselves, if life is like this, if suffering is unavoidable, then what is the meaning of living? More than 2,500 years ago, the Buddha also began his journey to enlightenment with that very question. When he was still Prince Siddhartha, he saw birth, aging, sickness, and death, for simple images that revealed the entire nature of human life. He realized that no throne was great enough to hide the suffering of existence, and no treasure was rich enough to buy peace of mind. And from that very moment of facing suffering, the path to liberation began to unfold. Because in Buddhism, suffering is not the enemy. It is the teacher. It is the doorway to wisdom. When we run away from suffering, we are merely running away from ourselves. But when we stop and look deeply into the nature of suffering, we begin to see something miraculous. Suffering is not a sentence, but an invitation to awaken. In the teaching of the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha taught that life is suffering, dukkha, suffering has a cause, samadaya, suffering can cease, nirodha, and there is a path leading to the cessation of suffering, magga. At first glance, it may seem simple. But it is the foundation of all Buddhist philosophy. To understand suffering, we must dare to look into our own hearts. To understand cause, we must see clearly the roots of all attachments, all subtle desires that control our thoughts and actions. And only when we have the courage to face both can we step toward cessation, where suffering dissolves not because we destroy it, but because we have understood it completely. Liberation in Buddhism is not a place somewhere outside this world. It is not heaven, nor some distant realm. Liberation is a state of mind, when we are no longer bound by illusion, no longer dragged by greed, anger, and ignorance. When our mind is as calm as a still lake, every reflection becomes pure. Then, the world remains the same. But the one who looks at the world has changed. The Channel Buddha's wisdom journey was born from that very spirit, as a journey to walk together through suffering, not by denial, but by seeing deeply and understanding profoundly. Every video, every story, every teaching here is a small lamp lit amidst the darkness of weary days. We do not speak of religion, but of the truth. Of life. Not of belief, but of the experience of consciousness, where suffering and peace, ignorance and enlightenment, are but two sides of the same coin. Suffering does not only come from loss, but also from clinging. We suffer because we want to hold on to what cannot be held. We suffer because we want to control what is impermanent. We suffer because we believe we must become someone else to deserve happiness. But the Buddha taught that true happiness does not come from becoming someone else, but from returning to ourselves in the present moment, where nothing needs to be fixed. Nothing needs to be added or taken away. When we understand this, suffering begins to dissolve. Not because we have overcome everything, but because we have stopped fighting. From within the stillness, a gentle light arises. That is wisdom. Wisdom does not come from books or theories, but from direct contemplation of life. Every time we pause, observe our breath, and feel our sorrow, without judgment, that is when we are walking on the path of liberation that the Buddha opened. And thus, the journey of suffering and liberation in Buddhism is not a story of the past, but the story of ourselves, of every worry, every wound, every tear searching for the way back to peace. Because in the end, we do not need to search far, suffering is the teacher. Life itself is the path, and our mind is the way. When we understand this, we no longer ask, why must I suffer, but begin to ask, what can I learn from this suffering? And in that very moment, the seed of liberation begins to sprout, quietly, gently, yet full of strength. That is where Buddhist wisdom seeks to lead us. Not as a philosophy to believe in, but as a path to live. To experience, to see clearly that even within suffering, freedom is already present. And when we see that with our own heart, all boundaries between suffering and joy, between captivity and liberation, between ourselves and the universe, dissolve. When the Buddha said, "Life is suffering," he did not speak with a pessimistic tone. He did not see life as a chain of endless tragedies. On the contrary, he was simply pointing out an obvious truth, that every being carries within itself traces of suffering, whether little or much, whether visible or hidden. This awareness was not meant to make people despair, but to open a door to awakening. Only when we truly understand the nature of suffering can we be free from it. Many people believe that suffering is something to be avoided. But in the Buddha's teaching, avoiding suffering only makes it sink deeper, grow stronger, and eventually dominate us in subtle ways we do not recognize. When we try to drive away sadness, we only reinforce it. When we try to forget fear, we only let it sink deeper into our hearts. The Buddha taught that the path out of suffering does not lie in escape, but in understanding. Only through mindful awareness can we see that suffering is not an external enemy, but a part of ourselves, a part that can be transformed. Observe a person in pain. When they lose something they love, their mind immediately resists. "No. I don't want this to happen." That resistance doubles the suffering. In fact, what causes us pain is not only the situation, but our reaction to it. One person may lose something and remain calm, while another falls into despair. Why? Because each person's attachment to the self differs. When that self is hurt, everything collapses with it. The Buddha called this tanha, craving, the desire and clinging for things to be the way we want. From craving arises grasping, from grasping arises becoming, and from there, the wheel of samsara continues to turn. We suffer because we want to hold on to what cannot be held, to control what cannot be controlled. But life, by its nature, is always changing. Everything is impermanent. Nothing, emotion, person, or material thing, can remain the same. The more we cling, the more we lose. The more we fear losing, the more we suffer. Looking deeply, we will see that suffering is not merely a negative feeling, but part of the structure of the mind. It exists in every moment we lose our presence. When we are not truly here in the present, we are living in suffering. Even if we have all the wealth, fame, or power, if our mind is still pulled into the past or driven toward the future, we are still lost. Because suffering does not come from circumstances, but from not understanding ourselves. Once, someone came to ask the Buddha, "Why am I always restless, always anxious, even though I have everything in life?" The Buddha simply smiled and asked, "What are you holding so tightly in your heart?" The man was silent, and then he understood. The answer was not outside, but in what he was clinging to. We hold too tightly to what is not real, to fame, gain, love, to endless expectations. And that very grasping is the root of suffering. When meditating, the practitioner does not try to eliminate suffering, but simply observes it. They watch pain arise and pass like watching clouds drift by. At first, this is very difficult, because the mind is used to reacting, used to resisting. But gradually, as the breath deepens, as awareness stabilizes, we begin to see the true nature of suffering. It is not a fixed entity. It comes, stays for a while, then goes. If we do not cling to it, it has no power to hurt us. This contemplation helps us realize, suffering exists only when we take it as mine. When we say, "I am hurt, I am sad, I am suffering," we identify ourselves with that feeling. But if we simply see, this is a feeling of pain arising, then the I is no longer in it. The pain becomes a phenomenon, like the rain or the wind. It comes and goes. Our mind remains peaceful, like a still lake. This is the difference between the awakened and the deluded. The deluded believe suffering is real, permanent, and fated. The awakened know that suffering is only a passing cloud in the sky of the mind. When the cloud dissolves, the sky remains intact. Likewise, when suffering passes, the clear nature of the mind remains, never lost. Understanding this, we begin to look at suffering with gratitude. Because it is suffering that opens the door for us to understand ourselves, to go deeper into reality. Without suffering, we would remain lost in the illusion that everything is fine, that we are happy. But when suffering comes, it brings us back to the ground, forces us to stop, to look back, and to ask, who am I? What am I living for? And that is the starting point of wisdom. Wisdom does not arise in pleasure or comfort, but in the moment we face what we fear most. The Buddha called suffering the great teacher, because it teaches through direct experience, without words, without doctrine. When we have the courage to sit still with suffering, without running, without explaining, without resisting, in that very moment, suffering begins to transform. From here, we can understand more deeply why the Buddha did not advise to end suffering by suppressing emotion, but by seeing its root clearly. Because suffering is the product of ignorance, of not seeing the truth. When the light of mindfulness shines, ignorance dissolves, and suffering vanishes by itself. Just as when we open the door, darkness does not need to be chased away, it disappears on its own. Thus, suffering is no longer something to fear. It becomes part of the spiritual journey, a mirror reflecting the truth of who we are. The practitioner of the Dharma does not seek to escape suffering, but learns to walk through it, with open eyes, with an open heart. For on the other side of suffering lies freedom. If the truth of suffering, dukkha arya sakha, is the first noble truth that helps us recognize the fragile and imperfect nature of life, then the truth of the cause of suffering, samadaya arya sakha, is the lamp that illuminates the deepest roots within the human mind. Because suffering does not arise on its own. It does not come from the outside world, but from the way we perceive it. The Buddha taught, because of ignorance and craving, beings wander in samsara. In that single sentence lies the entire secret of human suffering. Ignorance, avijja, does not mean stupidity, but the inability to see the truth. When the mind is covered by ignorance, we see everything through the veil of illusion, of I and mine. We believe ourselves to be a separate entity that can possess, control, and protect what we call self. From that mistaken belief, all attachments begin to arise. Imagine someone admiring a blooming flower. When the mind is clear, they simply see a flower. But when ignorance intervenes, they begin to see, my flower, a beautiful flower, the flower should last longer. From a neutral phenomenon, the flower becomes the object of desire. When the flower withers, that person suffers, not because the flower withers, for that is natural, but because they cannot accept that natural truth. Ignorance makes us forget that all things are impermanent, that nothing lasts forever, and that there is no unchanging self that can possess anything. But instead of realizing this, we continue to nurture the illusion of I, an I that wants to be recognized, to be loved, to be better than others, to hold happiness as if it were an object. And from there, tanha, craving, arises endlessly. Craving takes many forms. Craving for material things, sensual desire, the pursuit of power, or even spiritual ambition. Some crave wealth, others crave enlightenment. But if that desire still stems from the ego, it remains a form of suffering. Because as long as we want, we are not free. When we want something, we create tension between the present and the future, between what is and what is not yet. That tension is the root of suffering. Look within your mind, every time we say, I will be happy when I have love, when I succeed, when others understand me, when I reach a certain state. We are placing happiness outside the present moment. And in that very moment, we begin to live an illusion. The Buddha did not deny joy, but he pointed out that joy based on conditions is fragile. While true peace exists only when we are no longer dependent on any condition. The cause of suffering lies even deeper, in the attachment to self, atta. Every clinging arises from the idea of I am. When we believe there is an I, there immediately appears mine and not mine. From there come comparison, competition, defense, and fear. If there were no I, who would there be to lose? To gain, to be hurt? But we forget that the I is only a collection of the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, constantly changing. Nothing in them is fixed. The Buddha once used the example of a flame to explain to his disciples, a flame burns not because it has its own essence, but because the conditions, wood, air, and fire, come together. When those conditions cease, the flame goes out. Humans are the same. There is no self existing independently outside the conditions that make it. When one deeply understands this, the fear of loss also fades. Because there is no one to lose. There is nothing truly mine that must be kept. From ignorance and craving, the entire chain of dependent origination, Paticcasamuppada, operates. Ignorance conditions volitional formations, formations condition consciousness, consciousness conditions name and form conditions the 6 sense bases. The 6 sense bases condition contact, contact conditions feeling, feeling conditions craving, craving conditions clinging, clinging conditions becoming, becoming conditions birth, and from birth arise aging and death. That is the endless cycle of existence, of rebirths continuing without cease. But the Buddha saw clearly, if one link is broken, the entire chain collapses. And the weakest link is craving, attachment. Once we see that craving is the cause of suffering, we can let it go. But letting go is not done through force, nor through extreme asceticism, but through seeing clearly the nature of craving. When we truly see that every desire is an illusion, every attachment is futile, craving falls away naturally like a leaf from a branch. Just as when we see that the rope we mistook for a snake is only a rope, fear vanishes. We do not need to kill the snake, we simply see that it never existed. A meditator can directly experience this in each breath. When an emotion arises, for example, anger, instead of saying, I am angry, simply note, a feeling of anger is arising. Immediately, a space opens between the observing mind and the emotion. Then anger is no longer, but just an impermanent phenomenon. When the mind sees this clearly, craving has no ground to hold on to. Therefore, in Buddhism, prajna, wisdom, is not theoretical understanding, but insight born from direct experience. When we observe and see the truth for ourselves, no one can take it away. And in that very moment of seeing, the entire structure of suffering begins to collapse. The truth of the cause of suffering, samadaya sakka, is thus no longer an abstract concept, but a mirror reflecting the workings of the mind. Each time we cling to a thought, a person, or a result, we bind ourselves to the wheel of samsara. Conversely, each time we release an attachment or an illusion, we take one step out of suffering. The Buddha never promised that this path would be easy, because letting go is the hardest thing to do. But within that effort of mindfulness, we begin to realize something miraculous. When we no longer try to hold on to anything, we also have nothing to lose. And when there is nothing to lose, we are truly free. The truth of the cause of suffering not only teaches us the root of pain, but also reveals the interdependent nature of all phenomena. Nothing exists independently. When ignorance ceases, craving ceases, clinging ceases, becoming ceases, the whole cycle of birth and death comes to an end. This is the meeting point between the truth of the cause and the truth of the cessation, between the origin and the ending. And right there, one begins to feel the breath of liberation, a stillness that does not arise from having or not having, but from the deep realization that everything is already complete in its true nature. If the truth of suffering helps us recognize the nature of life's pain, and the truth of the cause of suffering shows us its root cause, then the truth of the cessation of suffering is the Buddha's gentlest promise, that suffering can end. But the cessation he spoke of is not annihilation, not an escape from the world or the suppression of emotions. Cessation, in Buddhist language, does not carry a negative meaning. It is calmness, the fading away of ignorance and craving, the moment when the mind returns to its pure nature, no longer bound by the mist of attachment and fear. When the Buddha attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, he did not discover something new, but simply saw clearly what had always been present, that in every moment, nirvana already exists. The end of suffering is not something we must search for in a distant place, but something we must recognize here and now, in this very moment when the mind is no longer ruled by wanting and not wanting. Therefore, the truth of cessation does not speak of another world, but of the awakened state of mind, where suffering cannot cling. Imagine, within our mind lies a lake, but it has long been stirred by the winds of delusion, the waves of desire, and the rains of fear. When these forces settle, the surface becomes still and reflects the whole sky. The sky has never left, we just have never been quiet enough to see it. The truth of cessation is that very moment when we see the sky within our own mind again, clear, untouched by time. The Buddha called this state nirvana, meaning to blow out or to extinguish the flame. But it is not the flame of life, it is the flame of ignorance, greed, hatred, and delusion, the flames that have burned the human heart through countless ages. When they are extinguished, we do not disappear, rather, the gentle truth of existence begins to reveal itself. We still live, still breathe, still smile, but everything is now seen through different eyes, the eyes of understanding and compassion. Nirvana is not a place, but a state of unconditional mind. Such a mind is no longer bound by past or future, no longer shaken by praise or blame, gain or loss, success or failure. It abides firmly in the present, like a mountain unmoved amidst storms. Everything around still changes, but that mind is no longer swept away. In that stillness, suffering finds no ground to grow. When the mind reaches nirvana, nothing needs to be added, nothing needs to be taken away. Everything is just as it is. One who has tasted the flavor of the truth of cessation no longer longs for anything else. They do not seek happiness, for they have become happiness. They do not chase peace, for peace is what they are. Within them, there is no distinction between self and others, between gain and loss. All boundaries dissolve in the light of wisdom. Yet to reach this cessation of suffering, the Buddha did not advise people to flee from life, but rather, to live deeply within it. For only amid the collisions, challenges, and uncertainties of existence can we truly observe how our mind operates. Without suffering, how could we know what cessation is? Without darkness, how could we recognize light? Right within the heart of suffering, the seed of nirvana already lies silently, waiting to be seen. The Buddha once taught, in the mind there is suffering, and in the mind there is nirvana. This means we do not need to go anywhere to find happiness, nor change the world to find peace. We only need to change the way we see. When we no longer react, no longer resist, no longer cling, nirvana manifests. Some may ask, if nirvana means the end of all desires, then what is the point of living? But they forget that only those who have been burned by the flames of desire truly know the value of coolness. To live in nirvana does not mean to be indifferent, but to live with complete compassion. One who has realized the truth of cessation no longer lives for themselves, but flows naturally in the stream of understanding and love. Every action they take no longer arises from ego, but from wisdom. Thus, the truth of cessation is not separation from the world, but awakening within it. Those who have seen Nirvana still walk, still stand, still speak, still smile, yet within every step, every breath, lies a profound stillness. They are no longer swayed by external conditions, because they understand that everything is but waves upon the surface of the sea, incapable of altering the ocean itself. There are moments in life when we suddenly touch a glimpse of Nirvana, when we sit quietly watching the sunset with a mind completely free of thought, when we forgive someone and feel the heart as light as the wind. When we finally let go of something that has burdened us for years, in those moments, suffering dissolves, the heart opens, and we touch a silence beyond words. That is the truth of cessation. Present within this very life, in every breath, every smile, every tear. Just as the moon does not shine by effort, but simply because the clouds have dispersed, the ending of suffering does not come through forced striving, but through the natural release of wisdom. When we understand this, we no longer seek liberation as a goal, but live in mindfulness from moment to moment. And within that mindfulness, the truth of cessation becomes a living experience, neither distant nor near, but right here, right now. When the mind, suffering loses its nourishment. When all illusions fade, only pure presence remains, that is the essence of Nirvana. It is not a reward for the good, but the inherent truth of all beings. The Buddha did not create Nirvana, he merely pointed it out, like one pointing to the moon for those looking in the wrong direction. And once we have seen that moon, we no longer wish to grasp it. For we understand that it was never far from us, only because we kept gazing into the water, we failed to see the sky. There is a silence that only those who have truly suffered can understand. It's not the silence of peace, but the silence after the storm, when the heart has cried all its tears, when every effort to escape pain has failed, and all that remains is the raw awareness of one's own existence. It is in this silence that the Buddha's teaching on suffering begins, not as a theory, but as a living truth reflected in every breath of human life. Suffering, or dukkha as the Buddha called it, is not something to be avoided or denied. It is the very foundation upon which awakening is built. The Buddha did not come to promise a world free from pain. He came to show that liberation lies within pain itself, in understanding it deeply, in seeing it clearly, and in transcending the illusions that give birth to it. To understand suffering, therefore, is to understand life. When we look around, suffering wears many faces. It hides behind success, whispers through loneliness, and lingers even in love. The ache of impermanence follows. Everything we cherish, youth, beauty, possessions, even the people we hold closest. Yet this realization is not meant to bring despair, but insight. The Buddha taught that suffering is not a punishment, it is the teacher that leads us to freedom. It invites us to question the roots of our attachment, the weight of our desires, and the endless search for something permanent in a world that constantly changes. Many of us spend our lives running, from discomfort, from loss, from ourselves. But the path of liberation begins when we stop running. When we dare to look directly into the heart of pain, we begin to see its true nature. The Buddha discovered that suffering is not eternal, it arises and fades, dependent on causes and conditions. And when those causes, ignorance, craving, and clinging, are understood and dissolved, what remains is not emptiness in the bleak sense, but vast peace. To walk this path is not to reject life, but to meet it fully. Every breath, every tear, every heartbeat becomes a doorway into awareness. The Buddha's wisdom is simple yet profound. Freedom is not found somewhere else, but here, within this very moment, when the mind no longer resists what is. On Buddha's wisdom journey, we explore this timeless truth, the art of transforming suffering into understanding, pain into compassion, and confusion into clarity. Through the teachings of the Dharma, we learn not to escape the world, but to awaken within it. Liberation is not the end of experience, it is the end of illusion. The Buddha once said, "I teach only one thing, suffering and the end of suffering." And within these few words lies the essence of all Buddhist wisdom. To know the nature of suffering is to see through the dream of self. To walk the path of liberation is to return home, to the stillness that was never lost, the awareness that has always been free. This is the beginning of our exploration, a journey not outward, but inward. A journey through the shadows of the mind toward the luminous clarity of awakening. As we walk together through the teachings of suffering and liberation in Buddhism, may we learn to embrace the truth that pain is not the enemy of peace, it is the gateway to it. When we understand the nature of suffering, we are no longer its victims. We become observers, awakeners, and students of our own lives. Every tear is no longer meaningless, every heartbreak is no longer a punishment, but a doorway to wisdom. The Buddha once said, "Within suffering lies the seed of enlightenment." That seed has always been within each of us, waiting for the right moment to bloom, when we stop blaming, stop running away, and turn to face the pain within our own hearts. The first step on the path to liberation is not to seek something grand, but to learn how to listen. Listen to our fears, listen to the fragility within, listen to each breath of the present moment. When we truly listen, we see that suffering is no longer an enemy, but our most loyal friend, the one who reminds us that everything is impermanent, that clinging only leads to loss. And that freedom lies not in control, but in letting go. Liberation is not somewhere far away. It is not found on a high mountain or in complex philosophy. Liberation is this very moment, when we sit still, breathe in, breathe out, and realize that we are alive. When the mind is no longer pulled by the past, no longer fearful of the future, then in that very instant, we are free. Freedom from suffering does not mean the end of emotions, but the understanding that every emotion is just a passing cloud in the sky of the mind. That sky has never been harmed, never lost its original stillness. The Buddha did not teach us to escape from life, but to live in the world without being bound by it. He showed us the middle way, not drowning in desire, nor strangled by extreme asceticism. The middle way is the path of understanding and awareness, where we learn to walk between the two shores, birth and death, gain and loss, love and hate. In that balance, suffering dissolves, because we no longer cling to any extreme of life. True liberation does not come from the outside. No one can give it to us, and no ritual can bestow it upon us. Liberation arises only when we see the true nature of all phenomena, impermanence, suffering, and non-self. When we see this clearly, the self, the root of all suffering, dissolves like darkness before sunlight. When there is no self to be hurt, no self to cling, suffering has nowhere to dwell. And then we realize, there is no journey greater than the journey back to ourselves. The path of practice is not about becoming someone else, but about returning to what has always been present, a mind that is still, clear, and full of love. In that stillness, everything is transformed, fear fades, hatred softens, and compassion naturally blossoms like a lotus rising from the mud, unstained by the mud itself. Suffering, when seen through the eyes of mindfulness, is the deepest teacher. It brings us back to the truth of life, forcing us to awaken from the long dream of ignorance. And in that awakening, we see that all beings are walking the same path, the path of seeking happiness, of returning to peace. When we realize this, compassion within us expands. We no longer wish to judge or compete, but only to love and to share. On Buddha's wisdom journey, this path is not just one of knowledge, but of spirit, of returning home, of awakening the inner light within each person. Every story, every teaching, every lesson is a mirror reflecting ourselves. Listening to these words, perhaps within you there is also a certain pain, silent or visible. But please, do not be afraid. For it is precisely from that place that the path to liberation begins. Let suffering become your guide, so that you can see the wondrous beauty of existence. Believe that beyond pain lies clarity. Beyond loss lies growth. And beyond suffering, lies liberation. If these words touch your heart, please share your feelings in the comments below. Each thought, each story of yours is a small light that helps our community illuminate the path of awakening. Together. And if you feel that this journey brings you peace, please subscribe to Buddha's Wisdom Journey, to continue exploring the wisdom of the Buddha, nurturing understanding and love in your soul. For the path of enlightenment is not the journey of one person alone. It is the journey of all of us, those who are learning to love, learning to let go, and learning to live with a free heart amidst the ever-changing flow of life. And when one heart is awakened, the whole world becomes brighter.